Hey everybody, welcome to another video. So the Dynasties of India DLC has given us this building called the Caravanserai. So what it does, if you don't know already, is it's supposed to boost the speed of trade carts within its radius, as well as heal them over time. So we can see that once we are in the range of the Caravanserai, we are moving a bit fast. Once we get out of the range, we can notice that we're moving a bit slower. And then if we take some damage on our trade cart and we move into this radius of the Caravanserai, we can see that we regenerate HP over time. So if we go into the Advanced Genie editor and we look at the Caravanserai, there's really nothing about this that would indicate that the ability to do what it's doing within its area of effect is associated with the unit at all. And that's because it isn't. Everything the Caravanserai is able to do is controlled by resources. So, for example, if we look at resource 255, that has the value of 1754, and correspondingly, that's the value of the Caravanserai. If we take a look at resource 256, the value is 8. And if we take some palisades and count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, that value of 8 represents the range. If we take a look at this value of 0.2, that represents the value of the speed increase. 919 represents the unit that's going to be affected. So 919 represents trade cart class, because if we go over to the units tab and go over to trade cart, the trade cart has class 19, and adding 900 to class 19 will enable this building to affect a certain class of unit instead of a specific unit ID. Now, it's really not super necessary to infer what everything does just based on its value. As we can see, the Advanced Genie editor doesn't label these resources very well, but if we were to go over to the excess constants file, for example, that labels things a bit better, or even the UGC guide has even more details on what's going on. But all that being said, the benefit of having all of these attributes of the Caravanserai being tied to resources instead of attributes of the unit or tasks that we could potentially modify is that we are able to modify those to produce some different effects. Now, the Caravanserai can have up to 2 different effects that it can apply to units in its radius. And before we get really far into it, I have to preface this by saying that there are quite a few limitations regarding the modding capabilities of the Caravanserai. Because there are only 3 possible things that can be applied to units which are within the range. So ability number 1 is value 5, and if we correspond to number 5 over here, that's movement speed, which is what the Caravanserai does to the trade carts. And then the other thing it does is value 109, and if we go down to the list, 109 is equal to regeneration rate. So besides the movement speed and regeneration rate, the only other thing that anyone has gotten to work is work rate, which is 13. So out of the dozens and dozens of other attributes that could be available, we are only able to modify those 3. And modifying any of these values to be different than their default value will inevitably change how the Caravanserai works and potentially won't work as normal Caravanserais do in the game. But that being said, we can see how we can use these resources to achieve some nice effects. So let us try something. So we have our test map loaded right now. So let's say instead of the Caravanserai spawning right in the middle, we'll have a town center. And right now we have a town center, and we can see that when our trade cart takes damage, we can get within the range of the town center, and we can notice that we're not healing and we're not receiving a speed boost. And that's because the boosting building, so to speak, its default value is 1754, and that's not what a town center is. But we could change that if we wanted to. So if we were to grab the resource, value for the boosting building, so ID 255, we would say effect amount mod resource. We'll change the boosting building, say ATTR set, and we will set the value of it to 109, which is the town center. And now what we can see happens is that this town center now has this secondary radius indicating that this is the boosting building. And now when we take damage from this archer and we move back into the radius of the town center, we can see that now the town center is having those secondary effects that the caravanserai would have because we changed the boosting building, so to speak. And we can also go a step further with this. So the default class for the unit to be affected is trade cart class. So that's resource 258. Now if I wanted to change the unit class that is affected from trade cart class to villager class, let me try to get villager class. So a villager class is 4, so add 900 to that, we would get 904. So now when our trade cart gets damaged, we can move it back into the range of the town center. We can see that nothing is happening. But now that we have the value of the unit to be affected to be the villager class, now it's the villagers that are going to be receiving the speed boost and the regeneration rate when they are within the range of the town center. And if we take a look back to the Advanced Genie editor again, we can see that this value of 60 is representing how quickly the regeneration rate is going to be happening. So if I take resource 261, I can modify that if I wanted to and say resource 261 is boosting value 2. So if I were to say boosting value 2 instead of the default of 60 is going to be negative 60, we can see that instead of the villager class gaining HP over time, the villager class is going to lose HP over time while it's within that radius. And let's just say that this effect of applying a regeneration rate was not an effect that we wanted to have at all. And instead we wanted to change it from a regeneration rate into a work rate boost. So I could take resource 260, which is going to represent boosting ability 2. And if I wanted to change the boosting ability from its default 109 into a work rate boost, which is 13, I can set this value to 13. And if I increase this work rate by a super high amount, we should be able to see a difference here. So now villager class is still what's going to be affected here, and we can see that the villager is gathering gold substantially faster than it would normally because we have the value of its work rate set to be so high. Now, it isn't always intuitive when we're modifying values of these boosting abilities what the new effect is going to be. And this basic template will help in determining what that's going to be because, as I said, it's not always going to be intuitive. For example, the new regeneration rate equals the original regeneration rate plus 3600 divided by the value, instead of the way it would normally work with effect amount by setting the attribute. When we do it this way, we would have to input a lower value in order to get a higher regeneration rate, which is, again, not very intuitive, but that's the way it works. Now, a couple limitations for modifying the boosting building is that you can only apply it to a building. So if you wanted to apply it to a king, for example, to have some sort of mobile boosting thing. So a king is 434. We'll try 434 and we'll say king. See, when the king is next to the villager, it's not necessarily gathering this gold any faster. It has to be, the boosting building has to be a building itself. Now, of the things I've tested, walls don't work as a boosting building. That actually crashed the game when I tried. But, for example, there are some units which are buildings which are actually mobile. Packed siege weapons and packed town centers are of those, so type building, but they actually have a movement speed. So if we say, instead of setting it to 434, we'll set it to 444, which is the packed TC. And even though the packed TC doesn't display a box around it, we can see that the villager is moving fast when it's close by. And we can see it gathered the gold super fast because the packed TC is technically a building type. So that's one way to allow a mobile boosting unit, but depending on the situation, it may look a bit weird, but of course, depends on your situation. Okay, so with all that knowledge in our back pockets, let's move on to a more practical example. So this map is called Lumbini, and besides being a nice map in general, a special feature that I wanted to add on this map is that units that get close to this Buddha statue in the middle would heal over time. And so I thought to mod the caravanserai resources to achieve that effect. So if I'm thinking that I want some inconspicuous looking building around here that I can set to the boosting building, I can look in the advanced gene editor and see if I can find a building. So I'll try and filter by standing graphic. So if I say SG -1, and then I'll say type 80. So there are a handful of buildings around here that don't have any standing graphics and they're going to be invisible and thus inconspicuous. We can see these are labeled empty buildings, but notice that they also have a class of wall, and I said that walls don't work as the boosting building. So what we're going to be relying on is this one over here, which is 1639, which used to be the monument resources enabler, but ever since we got effect amount to control monument resource generation independently, this building has been obsolete, so we can use this. So we'll grab that building constant. And now we can work on changing some of these resources around. So if I say effect amount mod resource, I want to change the boosting building boosting building ID to be ATTR set 1639. And ability 1 is normally value 5, which is movement speed. So if I want to remove the movement speed boost, I will say mod resource boosting ability 1 ATTR set, and I will set that to -1, which basically removes that effect altogether. So now at this point, the only effect that should be left over is the regeneration. Now I also want to modify the range slightly. So if I say range is default 8, I want to change it to 6. So now down on the object section, we need to create that object for every player. So if I say create object, building, set place for every player. Actor area to place in is right near the statue because the statue has actor area 1. We'll say ignore terrain restrictions. We'll say make indestructible. We will also say second object flare. So importantly, if we take a look, the Monument Resources Enabler normally has -2 hit points, so it would go away as soon as the game starts. So in order to make sure it sticks around, we're going to need to effect amount, set the attribute of the building, set that to 1 so it'll stick around and be there for the rest of the game. And notably, it's also indestructible so that you can't attack your enemy's building and remove their healing ability. Another thing we will do is we will modify the size of this building. So effect percent on ATTR radius 1 is going to be 50. Same with radius 2. So that will make it take up in 1 tile worth of space. Then something I've also found out is that if you try to display range indicators on an invisible object, the game is going to have a hard time with that and will crash. So what I found fixes that is if you're going to be sending an invisible object to the boosting building, that you also increase its max range. So ATTR max range, and I will set that to 6, which is going to be the boosting range. So when we restart our map, we can see that the statue is revealed because our second object flare is 332, which reveals the statue. And now when we approach the statue, we can see that when it's within our line of sight, we can see that square representing the boosting range. Now, notice that as of yet, we have not changed the value of resource 258. So it's still modifying trade card class. And this brings us to a limitation, is that we are only able to affect only one class at a time just through RMS effects. So if I wanted to change it to a Scout Cavalry class, I could do that, but it would only affect Scout Cavalry. It wouldn't affect villagers, which the intention of this was to heal any unit that would normally be healed by a monk. But just to make sure it's working for now, we will grab that boosting ability class. So if we say boosting unit class is going to be 904, we'll set it back to villagers. And we will attack this boar over here. So our villager is taking damage. And now we will move the villager over to the statue and see if the regeneration is working. And indeed, once we're within this range of the Buddha statue, we'll start regenerating HP over time. But we still need to get around this limitation of only affecting one class at a time. So in order to do that, what we are going to do is we are going to use an XS script. So what this XS script is basically doing is it's taking the boosting unit class and it's rapidly changing it every frame. So it's controlled by this variable up here, which is defined above, called VIX, and it starts out as value 1. So the first time it executes this rule, it will set the boosting unit class to villager class, and it will remain that way until the rule runs again, and it will set the value to 2, and for the duration of the next frame, the boosting unit class will be infantry class, and then so on next to archer class, and then to hand cannoneer class, and so on until it gets to the end, in which case, once you get to the end, king class, you reset and go back to villager class again. So it just keeps looping around and around. So this is a high frequency rule, so it will execute itself 60 times every second. So for every 1/60th of a second, a particular unit class will be able to regenerate its HP before the rule executes again and switches it to a different class. So let's see the effect of that in the game. So now we can see that we have both a villager and a scout which are damaged. And now let's move into the range of the statue and see what happens. So we can see that we're technically regenerating, but the rate looks quite a bit slower than it was last time. We have it set to the default 60, which is supposed to be 60 HP per minute. But what's happening here is that the amount of time that a particular class is selected is going to be 1/12 of the total time it would be otherwise. Since that 60 HP per minute is being divided by 12 total classes, the effective regeneration per class is going to be 60 divided by 12, which is going to be 5 HP per minute instead. So in order to make everything regenerate faster, we need to increase the rate of regeneration. And since the value of regeneration is 3600 divided by the value, it means we need to decrease the input value for regeneration in order to get a higher resulting regeneration rate. So I don't necessarily want it to be 60 for each unit class. I think 30 would be good enough. So if I were to say, if we started at 60 HP per minute and we wanted to go to 30, you could say times 2 would get to 120. And if we were to say 3600 divided by 120, we'd be at 30 HP per minute. But we still also need to consider that we need this to be 12 times higher for each class. So it would be value 120 divided by 12, and dividing by 12 would make it 10 times higher to get the resulting value of 10. So that would be boosting ability 2 value resource 261. And we'll set that to 10. So now we can bring the damaged scout and the villager in here and now we can see they are regenerating slightly faster, approximately 30 HP per minute, as opposed to the previous iteration, which was only 5 HP per minute. Okay, so for a couple closing tips, I decided to switch over to another example. So these area of effect buildings that we can use to add effects into our maps, I advise to use with caution. So this example is called Morass, and the idea was to place a bunch of area of effect buildings within this swamp so that units that walk in here will slow down. Now, if you think about it, we have so many tiles worth of space that's comprising this terrain, and for every tile here, we need a building for every single player in the game, and throughout the game, that building needs to be constantly checking whether a unit is in its radius or not to see what to do about it. So I hesitate to unpause this, but basically this is only a 2-player game right now, and already the lag is so bad that it's practically unplayable. So instead of trying to do every tile, what we can try to do is space them out intermediately, and then instead of saying that the radius is 0.5, which would equate to just 1 tile worth of space, we'll set the radius to 1, so it'll take up a larger area. So when we do that, we can see that the game is a bit less laggy. And we can see that when we are within the radius of these buildings, that the scout's going to be slowed down a bit. But the fact that we had to space things out will lead to gaps in the area of effect. You can see where I'm walking here, the scout's at normal speed because there's a gap. And once I walk in here, it slows down. So I could potentially increase the radius even more, but that may result in covering more area than just the swamp. So it's something to keep in mind how many or how few objects you want if you're trying to comprise it on a terrain. And then also keep in mind that this is only a 2-player game, and if you had a larger map with more players, obviously that's more area to cover and more players that need their objects placed. And then obviously when you have these range indicators on, it's going to look weird either way. Another interesting thing about these areas of effect is that you don't necessarily need to be affecting units per se. You can affect buildings as well. So for example, if I set the boosting building ID back to the town center, and I set the boosting unit class to 903, 903 would be representing class 3, which is building class, and then I switch the ability from a speed boost to a work rate boost, which is 13, and I say set the value to 5, basically the speed at which buildings research technologies and produce units is tied to work rate. So if I have a barracks within the range of the town center, which is the boosting building, you can see it creates the militia substantially faster. And the boosting building can even affect itself. So the town center is the boosting building, and I can research Loom super fast because the town center is technically a building class also. So hopefully this has given you guys a good taste of area of effect buildings and what possibilities they can be used for, as well as some of the limitations that exist currently. In the future, hopefully we can expand on this more, get more abilities and potentially more ways to produce areas of effect. But for now, I think this is going to be it for me for now. So thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you next time.